All right, I'm Judith Tucker, and I'm on the faculty here at Georgetown. I'm a historian, and I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Salim Tamari, who is a visiting professor here at the center this year, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and he's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies here in Washington, and he is the director of the Institute for Palestine Studies affiliated Institute of Jerusalem Studies. And Dr. Tamari is actually got his PhD in sociology and is a professor of sociology at Birzeit University. But as you will soon experience, he has actually migrated into the field of history, and we're very happy to have him. He is going to be talking about his most recent publication, Year of the Locust. But he is also the author of a number of other books, including The Intimate Life of an Ottoman Soldier, The Mountain Against the Sea. He has edited Biography and Social History of Bilad Sham, as well as a volume entitled Pilgrims, Lepers, and Stuffed Cabbage, Essays on Jerusalem's Cultural History. I'm going to obviously give the floor to Professor Tamari to talk about this book. It is I think, a very exciting publication. It is a window. I just came from class, and we were basically talking about some of the incredible traumas of the First World War in the region of today's Lebanon and Syria. But I think it would apply, much of the same material would apply to Palestine as well, that what an incredibly traumatic period this was for the inhabitants of the region, and how under-researched it's been, how that we've had almost no information, and certainly no eyewitness report that I'm aware of, about the kinds of events, dislocations, and traumas that were suffered by the population at that time. So it's really very exciting to have this book and to have the author here to talk about it. So thank you very much for doing this, Salim. And how long do you wish to speak for? As long as you wish to, right? But then afterwards you would take questions, comments, discussion. So, okay, we'll move on to that phase, yeah.
Thank you, Judith, for having me here. And I want to thank Maggie Daher for arranging this event tonight, including the bringing of the books and the nice food outside. I'm very honored, actually, to have with us Salim Tamari and Dorothea, his wife, who are really responsible for me acquiring this diary and all the documents that went along with her. Saleh is a great man, and he's a descendant of the soldier I'm going to talk about, and I'm very proud to have him here with us. Perhaps he should be actually here instead of me, but this is what happened. I'm going to talk briefly about the background to this diary that I edited with the title The Year of the Locust, the Great War and the Expunging of the Ottoman History from Palestine. The Arabic edition is substantially bigger for reasons that I will explain later. And I'm very happy that UC Press has chosen to publish it in English. The Great War was a pivotal event for the whole Middle East and the remaking of new states, and for the reinvention of new state boundaries, etc., but also for the total transformation of people's consciousness about their own identity. And this is what I want to examine today with you through the diaries of the soldiers I'm going to talk about. The war actually was fought in the Ottoman area in 4 different fronts. In Gallipoli, which is the famous one, and the one to which is attributed the birth of the Australian nation, because of the defeat of the Australian soldiers and their use as cannon fodder by the British. It was also fought on the northeast in the Caucasian front on the Russian borders, where one of our soldiers was captured and ended up his days in most of the war in Siberia. Very famous battles were also fought, but much less known, in Kut al-Amara around Basra, north of Basra in southern Iraq, involving mostly Indian soldiers. And finally, the Suez Front, which in Turkey is known as the Palestine Front, was fought along the Beersheba-Sinai borders and Gaza, and finally in Jerusalem. And much of what I'm going to talk about concerns this last front. I should say that most of the war was fought by proxy soldiers on both sides. On the British side, on the side of the Allies especially, the use of New Zealand, Australian, but especially Indian soldiers was heavily involved, especially in Kut al-Amara in the south and in the Palestine Suez Front. The Ottomans had a habit of using ethnic soldiers who would be sent to a front away from home, so that in case of desertion, they would not be able to go back. That's why a lot of Turkish and Bulgarian soldiers were used on the Suez Front, and Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese soldiers were fought in Gallipoli. Most of the fighting under Mustafa Kemal in Gallipoli involved Syrian battalions, actually. Although in the war, eventual war, they were subsumed as Turkish soldiers because they were all Ottomans, and the Kemalist government began to use the word Turkish to mean Ottoman and Ottoman to mean Turkish. So they somehow got lost in the statistics of this war. The great tragedy of that war is that the much richness which typified the Ottoman period, which had to do with autonomous cultural, socioeconomic development, was eventually subsumed by the tragedies of the 4 years of the war. So people filtered the memory of the Ottoman period not through the constitutional achievements, the democratic changes of 1876 and the remaking of the constitution and the investments in public buildings and education, which the Ottomans did over 450 years, but through the 4 years of the devastation of the war. And this filtration is important because we have begun to look at that period both in Turkish nationalist historiography, in Arab nationalist historiography, and throughout the region by Macedonians, Armenians, Greeks, through the lens of that dark period. And much of it is involved accusation of betrayal, who betrayed whom, who stabbed who in the back. And this is felt both through the diaries I'm going to talk about, but especially through the historiography, which over the last 15 years, luckily, we began to transcend with new revisionist ways of looking at the war, and the end of the Ottoman period have begun to emerge through very important scholarship by both Turkish and Arab, as well as other international historians. The locust in the title of my book is crucial because it's symbolic of the way people's collective memory filtered that past. 1915 involved the invasion of the locusts, the famine which ensued because of the destruction of the crops, and of course the diseases that accompanied the war, conscription known as Seferberlik, but you have typhus, which killed a lot of soldiers on the east in the same way that cholera and the flu killed people on the Eastern European and Central European fronts. But in the Middle East, the region is also known through the dictatorship of Jamal Pasha and the Fourth Army, which through massive conscription of soldiers, sending young people away to faraway fronts where they never came back. And of course, after 1915 in August, when he began to pursue the nationalists and establish the gallows. It's also known through the movement identified as Seferberlik, which is the conscription of soldiers, which began in earnest in November 1914 and then took away the bulk of the male adult population in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Transjordan to the front. Many of these young men were sent to the front, but older people were conscripted in what is known as the Labor Battalion, Tabur al-Amali, or Shaghili, which was back-breaking labor, opening roads, digging trenches, and so on. So a lot of the minorities who were not trusted by the regime were also involved in this labor battalions. This is the picture of the digging of these trenches along the southern Palestine border near Beersheba. And of course, in the collective memory of Syria, which is the term for all the eastern region of the Arab Mashriq, the memory of the war is exemplified through the gallows which were established first in Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, and then in Damascus itself, and most importantly in Martyr Square in Beirut, after the summary trials of the Alay tribunals. This is the picture of Martyr Square before the late Hariri took it over and established a new Solidaire out of it. So here I use soldiers' diaries to see how ordinary young men under conscription saw the war. And I am dealing with 3 people in this book. All of them served in the Ottoman army, and all of them wrote diaries. It's very rare that you have ordinary soldiers writing diaries. Mostly it's officers and aristocrats, partly because literacy was not so widespread, and partly because people who were politically active tend to write their memoirs. But to have diaries written on a daily basis is quite unique. And I'm very lucky, actually, to be able to have access to these 3 diaries. The first one involved Arif Shhadi, who was a graduate of the military academy in Istanbul, and the son of a merchant from Jerusalem. Lucky for him, or unlucky for him, he was captured in Erzurum, a Erasure battle in the Caucasian front in November 1915, and spent all of the war he did not miss a single day of the war in prison in Khorasan in Siberia. And Siberia was a great moment of liberation for him, because they left them, there were 80,000 people, Ottoman soldiers in that prison. They left them to roam around unattended, and they had a hell of a time. So this diary shows a very significant way in which this soldier, first going through a great deal of solidarity with his Turkish Albanian comrades, became aware of the Arab rebellion under Sharif Hussein and joined the rebellion while he is in Siberia. The second one is Lieutenant Mehmet Fasih, who was a soldier from Mersin and who fought with Kamal Pasha. This Jamal, by the way, is Jamal Mersinli, another Jamal. But he fought with Mustafa Kemal in Gaza and in Gallipoli. He was much decorated. And he's the only one of the 3 who wrote his diary entirely in Turkish. He was also the most devoted to the war effort, proposing himself to go on suicide operation against the Australians in Gallipoli, in the fight for the Dardanelles. And last but not least, we have soldier Ihsan Turjman from Jerusalem, who escaped service in Suez and spent most of the year, as we shall see, playing with his mustache in a clerical job in Jerusalem. Of the three soldiers, he's the only one who observed the transformation of daily life in the city of Jerusalem and brought to us a vivid portrait of the modernity of the city under war, but also devastation, transformation in the normative life, which I hope we'll have time to just read excerpts to you from. It's interesting that these two soldiers, unlike Shahadi, Fasih was what I would call a Turkified Arab. He's from Mersin, which is a mixed city, and his identity actually reflected to the ambivalence of Ottoman identity at the end of the war, where involving people who were ethnically Turk and ethnically Arab, but some people were both, either because they were of mixed parentage or because they spoke both languages, or because basically the crystallization of nationalist identity had not yet gelled. So although this man wrote in Turkish, he actually uses a lot of Arabic word in his writings, and he writes a lot of Syrian songs from the Aleppo region, which gave me the impression that he probably comes from an Arab ethnic background. But I call him a Turkified Arab. And Ihsan al-Turjman, who comes from a family of translators in Jerusalem, comes from a long line of translators coming from Aleppo, possibly with Turkish roots, because they all translated from Turkish to Arabic in course. That's why their name is Turjman. And that's his picture on his 23rd and last birthday, before he was killed. He received a typical Ottoman education for the sons of the urban merchant classes. Went to the Kutab inside the Haram area, and then went to study in the Dusturiya College, headed by Sakakeeny, a modernist pedagogue in Jerusalem. And he used a lot of his connections with his uncle, Raghib bin Khaldi, to be reassigned from the front and to serve in the clerical job that he ended up doing for the Fourth Army. He served under Commander Ali Roshenbek, whose big mustache appears here, and he was the commander of the Jerusalem garrison, very famous military, courageous commander who went, after defeat in Jerusalem, went on to fight in Aleppo, and then retreated with the Ottoman army to Anatolia, and then later fought with what is known as the War of Independence against the Greek partisans. And I was able to find a number of military intelligence reports about him from the Ottoman archive. This is one of them from Ankara, showing his prowess in the war. Ihsan, who wrote this diary, was aware from the text that he was writing for posterity. And he did not think he will die in the war, but he was writing for an abstract audience that's to come. Much of the diary is consumed by his love for a woman he calls Thuraya. We know that's not her real name. What's interesting about this diary is that part of it were written in code. And initially, I was not able to crack the code. I thought it must be he was involved in some political underground activity. But it turns out that much of it had to do with his love life, and he was afraid his father would find the diary and monitor it. One reason is because one of his crushes was his teacher's wife. For him, he had what do you call it? What did he have for her? The hots? And he would keep repeating her name in code. I finally was able to break the code with the help of a poet friend of mine who opened up the secret of his desires. One interesting aspect of this diary is the debates that Ihsan reports that were going on in the officer courts in the Jerusalem Commissariat about the fate of the country. And there they discussed the future federation of an Arab, Turkish, Ottoman state, or independence within Greater Syria, which was the most favored solution for the future of Palestine, or an independent country called Palestine, which would break away from Istanbul, which was a minority position from the way he was talking about. And he lists a fourth option, which is quite interesting, which is federation with Egypt. And that's the one he favored for the future of Palestine. You notice from this map that Palestine in Ottoman parlance was the country south of Jaffa, because that was the parameter of the Quds Sharif Mutasarrif, which is the Quds Sharif province, Sanjaq, was actually what we call today southern Palestine. And that was the region called Palestine, as you can see from this map, Palestine. And the heart of Palestine was, as you can see, is the desert of being lost, which is Sinai. In Turkish, Tih Sahrasi, which is the Sinai desert. So the western borders of Palestine were the Suez Canal, and that's where the fighting was going on at the time. And that has to do with why they saw that it was natural to expect that after the war, Palestine would become part of an Egyptian Syrian confederation. The carnage of the war disrupted the normative life in the city, and this had to do a lot with the disappearance of young men from the public sphere, widespread poverty, hunger, and the spread of prostitution, which was unheard of for the Holy City, to see young women selling themselves because they had to eat. And this was a totally overwhelming phenomena for Ihsan, who had a very strict moral discipline, which he inherited from his family. To see all these women running in the streets begging and selling their bodies was quite shocking to him. At the time, the Ottomans had established a number of bordellos for the Austrian, German, and senior Ottoman officers, and the Holy City became basically a big whorehouse during the war. Jerusalem, at the end of the war, was no longer the center of the world. The whole mechanisms of transporting soldiers, electrification, the building of the Hijazi Railroad, which took people way out to the Medina in Arabia and up to Aleppo and the Dardanelles, opened the world to a much larger entity. First, Syria, which became the sort of geographic unit of the Arab East, but also the Ottomanism began to mean something bigger to them, exactly at the same time when they began to lose hope that the war will end up with a united Ottoman domain. Soldiers' diaries are important because they are written in the heat of the moment, and they are significantly different from the retrospective memoirs of politicians. They reveal a perspective that is often missing from the filtered wisdom of reflections written several decades after the event. Most importantly, they compel us to question the assumptions of nationalist rewriting of history, and in the case of the post-Ottoman period, the nature of the Ottoman regime that prevailed in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan. In this case, our hero, Ihsan, was shot dead by his Albanian officer in the winter night of December 1917, just before Allenby's forces stormed Jerusalem and the bulk of the Ottoman army, Arabs, Turks, and Albanians, withdrew towards Nablus and the northern territories. what I want to do is just to give you a glimpse of these diaries, some excerpts from this young man who died at the age of 23 before he got to his 24th birthday, full of hope about the future at the end of the war. So is it all right? Do we have time to?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, he starts his diary on 15th of March. The story of the diary actually is quite amazing, how I got the diary and how I found the name of the author, which led me to Saleh here, because nowhere in there does he mention who he is and which family he belongs to. So there was a great deal of detective work, which I can tell you later about, to find out who he was. So, oh dear, I forgot my glasses. Can I use your glasses? Yeah, they're perfect. This is 15th of March, 1331. This is the Ottoman fiscal calendar, which is equivalent to March 28th, 1915 in the Gregorian calendar. This evening I went to visit Khalil Effendi Sakakeeny, his teacher, in the company of Hassan Khalidi and Omar Saleh Barghouti. Khalil Effendi read to us from his diary. It so excited me that I decided to restart my own memoirs. Our conversation revolved around this miserable war and how long it is likely to continue, as well as the fate of this Ottoman state. We more or less agreed that the days of the state are numbered and that its dismemberment is imminent. What will be the fate of Palestine? We all saw two possibilities: independence or annexation to Egypt. The last possibility is more likely, since only the English are likely to possess this country, and England is unlikely to give full sovereignty to Palestine, but is more liable to annex it to Egypt and create a single dominion ruled by the Khedive of Egypt. Egypt is our neighbor, and since both countries contain a majority of Muslims, it makes sense to annex it and crown the Viceroy of Egypt as the King of Palestine and Hijaz. And then on March 29th, he makes the following entry. People keep inquiring as to what I do and where I work. I tell them that I work at the Commissariat of the 4th Imperial Army with Commander Ali Roshan Bey. As for the first part of the question, I hesitate to answer, since I'm not sure what my job is exactly. If I were to say I am a clerk, I would be lying, since when I sat for the exam, the officer in charge decided that my handwriting was not good enough for official correspondence, which is a great tragedy because I had to read 200 pages of his handwriting. I was then assigned to a desk to stamp and file official documents. Occasionally I am sent on errands for the commissariat, and sometimes I take dictation. Most of the time I just sit there playing with my mustache. There are countless clerks in this Ottoman state who are like me, occupy office space, know nothing, and receive a salary at the end of each month. This sounds very typical, actually, of many people. Such a state is bound to disappear. And then on April 22nd, 1915, he writes, an English plane threw leaflets over Ramla this morning. I heard that one of our planes crashed between Hafir and Ibn, but I have no concrete news. This can only be attributed to one of two reasons. He's talking about the crashing of the Ottoman plane. Badly trained pilots or badly maintained engines. Isn't it time for us Ottomans to leave this farce behind us and conclude a peace agreement? The Labor Battalion was finally established, made up primarily of Christians, Jews, and very few Muslims, not more than 20. And then they announced the Garbage Battalion, which had no Muslims in it. This is a vengeance indeed. The next step would be to start accusing people of espionage. And then on Tuesday, the 27th of April, he writes, Ahmed Jamal Pasha issued an order today in celebration of anniversary of Sultan Mehmed Rashad V's ascension to the throne, to distribute mutton and sweets to members of the armed forces. He also ordered the illumination of public buildings. A big party was being prepared for the commissariat, where he worked, to be presided over by the two Jamals, that's Ahmed Jamal Pasha and Muhammad Jamal, who was known as mercenary leader of the 8th Army, and other seniors, admirals, and officers. We were ordered to extend electric lights and decorations in the gardens of Notre Dame de France. To celebrate the anniversary, a number of notables and their ladies were invited to Notre Dame. An orchestra performed while liquor flowed. A number of Jerusalem prostitutes were also invited to entertain the officers. I was told that at least 50 well-known whores were among the invitees. Each officer enjoyed the company of one or two ladies in the garden compound. While this was happening, our brothers were fighting in the Dardanelles. We just heard that the English have made a major landing in Janak Qal'a, which is the Turkish name for Gallipoli, and that we have taken 4,000 of their prisoners. Our officers here are celebrating, but God knows the condition of our soldiers in the front. When I exited the main entrance of the commissariat, I saw the invitees arriving in droves, entering through the gate lit by electricity. On the door was a huge sign saluting our Sultan. I suddenly became despondent and very sad for our condition. On Thursday, April 29th, he writes, leaving the commissariat, I met a soldier who told me that Hassan, my cousin, was waiting for me at the Manshia Gardens. There I found the night officer sitting at a cafe. I walked close by the wall so he wouldn't see me, and I slipped into the Manshia. At 7:30 I went with Hassan to visit Khalil Effendi. On the way we came across a prostitute loitering by the Austrian hospice. I said to Hassan, this poor woman waiting for her deliverance. He said, what can she do? She has to live. She makes a majidi per trick to survive. What miserable creatures, selling their bodies for pennies to satisfy the bestial needs for men. And this goes on and on in the diary, and he's shocked that the city he knew was no longer the same that was familiar to him, both in terms of changing demography, but the normative system that carried daily life. And then on May 12th, at 5:30 I left the commissariat and went to see my father. He told me that the inspector of education for the Syrian districts came to the Baqa office of education 2 days ago and questioned the staff about 2 prostitutes who were seen on school premises. It transpired that teachers from the local school were involved. These were Kamal Khatib, sorry to name them, but they're all dead. They were Kamal Khatib, Sami Khatib, not your Sami, Zuhdi Alami, and Sheikh Yaqub Azbaki. When the inspector verified the incident, he presented the report to the Director of Education, who in turn forwarded it to the district governor. The latter ordered that the teachers involved be expelled from their positions. The parliamentary deputy from Jerusalem, Fate Alami Effendi, intervened and had the directive softened. Eventually, teachers were fined by the salary cut of 150 qirsh. And then on Wednesday afternoon, he writes the following: this must be one of the happiest days in my life. I can hardly believe that this is not a dream. For I came across my beloved, and I hope my future partner. She was standing in front of her house, chatting with one of the neighbors, with her veil lifted. When she saw me, she slowly lowered her veil, but kept chatting with her friend. Beneath the veil, I saw a shining moon, and a beauty that is without parallel. I wish I were a poet so I can compose a stanza for this occasion. How happy I will be to marry her. I have met many women in my life, Europeans and Americans, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, but never encountered the lady with such graces. My main fear is that someone will come and take her away from me. Whenever I think of this possibility, I go mad with worry. On May 20th, the locusts have reached Jerusalem. This is the beginning of the devastation. Locust swarms are spreading everywhere, and the insects are laying their eggs. Crops have been laid waste across the country, but the situation is particularly severe around Jaffa and its environments. People arriving from the city report that citizens are compelled to go out in the fields and destroy the locusts. Those who refuse or are unable to do so are fined 1 Ottoman lira for each day, 6 days. Of abstaining from collecting the insects. I was told by my mother that her brother saw the locust swarms in Baqa, which is the southern part of Jerusalem. May God protect us. And then typhus arrived on May 24th. I was shocked to hear today about the death of Ahmed Effendi Nashashibi, the son of Hajj Rashid Effendi and the brother of Raghib Bey, the current deputy from Jerusalem. He died from typhus in the prime of his youth. He was buried this afternoon. Diseases are spreading like wildfire among the population. I was told from one of the health inspectors in town that 4 typhus cases were reported in one day alone in Bab Hutta. When I heard the news, I was struck with great dread, not only for the people, but for myself. And then he talks about about Jamal Pasha, who issued an order communicated by phone to the commissariat Wednesday evening at 5:30, preventing soldiers to sleep in their homes. And then he reacts. He says, I cannot imagine myself fighting in the desert front. And why should I go? To fight for my country? I am Ottoman by name only, for my country is the whole of humanity. He was quoting in this his teacher, Khalil Sakakeeny, who kept saying, I'm an Ottoman by name only. Humanity is my... Excuse me. Who kept repeating this phrase. Even if I'm told that by going to fight we will conquer Egypt, I will refuse to go. What does this barbaric state want from us? To liberate Egypt on our backs? Our leaders promised us and other fellow Arabs that we would be partners in this government and that they seek to advance the interests of the conditions of the Arab nation. On September 30th, 1915, he makes the following entry. Every major town in Syria and Palestine is sending a delegate to Jana Qala, to Gallipoli, to salute the memory of our martyrs in this war and to visit the wounded and inspire the living to continue with their jihad. The delegates from Jerusalem are Sheikh Tahir Effendi, Abu Saud, etc., etc. They left for Istanbul a few days ago. This is a strange government. What do our leaders intend to accomplish with these games? Do they mean to strengthen the relationship between the Arab and Turkish nations? Or do they mean to incite religious fervor? Or perhaps they mean to satisfy the egos of religious clerics. What is definite is that the people are very unhappy with this government. But truth be told, the Palestinian and Syrian people are a cowardly and submissive lot. For if they were not so servile, they would have revolted against these Turkish barbarians. And then he shifts to a more loving mode. This is October 10th. He says, here is a list of conditions for achieving happiness. 1. Once this war is over, I will study French and go to college in Beirut and finish my university education. Better still to study agriculture in Europe. 2. I will marry Thuraya, which is my secret name for her. My love for her is limitless, especially now that I have seen her face without cover. I know that Thuraya is rather ignorant in matters pertaining to the management of the household, but living with her will overcome this liability. And then in 1916, rebellion. Sharif Hussein Pasha declared rebellion against the state. There were demonstrations in Medina and some of the Hijazi rail lines were destroyed, but the rebels' numbers were few and they were dispersed. Could this be the beginning every Arab should be pleased about? How can we support the state after it killed our best youth? They were hanged in public squares like common criminals and gangsters. They were executed for demanding their rights and for questioning their fate in the general conscription. They died, and not one voice was raised in protest in this miserable Arab nation. Not one Palestinian or Syrian voice. May God bless our Hijazi leader and strengthen his hand. Actually, from reading the memoirs, you become aware that what he meant by a minority, because much more Arabs continued to fight on the Ottoman side than in the ranks of the Arab rebellion, and this continued to be until the very end. Even when the Ottoman army withdrew from Jerusalem, went up north, much of the Arab forces withdrew from them and continued to Aleppo. It's only after defeats in Aleppo that you have major desertions from the Ottoman army. And then the end comes. On August 17th, he says, they say that July is the best month of the year. It sounds like T.S. Eliot. Since it has witnessed the liberation of nations, for me it has been the ugliest and vilest of months. Here's what happened. On Friday, the 1st of July, 1332, by the Eastern Ottoman fiscal calendar, as I was working at my desk at the commissariat, my officer, who is an Arnauti is Arabic for Albanian, asked me to read a paper in which he had written a few lines. Then he tore it into pieces before I could see it. I was confused about its contents, since it was not meant to be an official statement for the registry that I was filing. Minutes later, he came over and said that he wanted to kiss me between the eyes. My face became pale and I wanted to beat him up, but I decided to control myself, did not respond. He came back and said he wanted an answer. Do not fear, he said. I do not want to harm you. I love you tremendously, God knows why, for I cannot bear this situation anymore. And I have been suffering from your love for over 20 days. I said nothing. Then he asked me to allow my forehead and hair to show underneath my military cap. And then one dark night on August 4th, the man comes with a gun to the haram, where he was living inside the haram compound, and wakes him up and starts screaming at him. He was completely drunk. And he claimed that both Commander Roshan Bey, inspector of the commissariat, and Nihad Bey, the chief of staff, wanted these papers urgently. I finally got rid of him. It was 1:30 past midnight, Frangi time, because they used the Zawali time by the sun. I returned home and found Rustum Effendi standing at the staircase, eavesdropping on our conversation. This is their neighbor. In the evening, I went to see my uncle. He files a complaint against this man in the commissariat, and his uncle is discussing it with him. He said that he had found an interlocutor who promised to arrange a meeting with Commander Roshan Bey so that he can present a complaint to him. I asked him to delay the meeting since I felt that the Albanian was beginning to behave properly, and we may as well forget the whole issue. This bloody saga has been going on for some time. One moment he is kind and considerate, and I feel relieved, and the next thing he is back to his old habits. And then I say to myself, no, I cannot bear this anymore. And that's the last entry in the diary. And then we know that he was shot dead soon after that. And then there was a very moving entry from also the other diary by Khalil Sakakeeny, who was at the time in the central jail, Ottoman jail in Damascus. This was recorded in July 11, 1918. I was lucky to find this entry, actually. He says, I remember Arif and Adil Bey, al-Turjman, and their good father, the Honorable Hassan Bey. I keep asking for forgiveness for their brother Ihsan, our man, whose sweet memory never leaves my thoughts. May God have mercy on his soul. And that's the paragraph from Khalid Sakakeeny. So this is a very small excerpt from the diary, and I hope it will encourage you to look at it. And thank you.
So you're willing to entertain questions and comments? So how did you figure out who he was?
It took me about a year to find his identity, because in his diary, which actually was found in the Hebrew University archives, they call it abandoned property archives, which is papers taken from the private homes of Palestinians in the War of 48. In this case, it was taken, I found exactly where it was found because they kept a record of it, and it was taken from Prophet Street, where the Turjman family had their house in the Musara neighborhood. So the diary is full of ranting about the army, but also a great deal of love and affection, not only for his teacher Khalid Sakakeeny, but for his wife, on whom Ihsan had a crush and entered her name in code. So obviously he intimately knew Sakakeeny, and there's one page where his mother is asking him to leave this woman he is having a hopeless affair with, and she calls him by his first name, Ihsan. So we found out his name. But which family? The family that is only mentioned in the book is the Khalidi family, who are his maternal uncles. So I went all over the Khalids, and there's many Khalidis in the town, and none of them knew who this Ihsan was, related to them on the mother's side. So finally, I found the Sakakeeny Diary, which is made up of 4,000 pages. I read 4,000 pages in handwriting of the Sakakeeny Diary. And there's one entry, there's actually 3 entries in the Sakakeeny Diary, which correspond to the entries in this diary. There are 3 days in which both of them wrote the diary, because they did not write every day. And of the 3 days, there was one day where Ihsan was visiting his teacher. So I looked at the Sakakeeny Diary, and indeed, he mentions the visit of this soldier. And they both discuss paying the badal to escape from the army. They had to pay £50, and Sakakeeny could not afford it. So Ihsan was suggesting that he contact his relatives for the money. So he mentions his name. He says, my student Ihsan Turjman came, and he mentioned his family name, and that's how I made the connection. So then was the process of finding who this Turjman family was. There's a lot of Turjmans, by the way. There are Jews, Christians, and Muslims who are Turjman. And he was obviously a Muslim because he lived in the Haram. So I began to Google people. And that's what led me to this young man in the back, actually through Nabiha, his sister, who led me to Salih. And Salih finally met with me in Jerusalem, and he gave me the birth certificate and the family papers, which helped me contextualize this man. So Google was critical, actually, in locating.
The hero of the story.
Yes.
Just to relate what you have just with your own studies and your own assessment of the way the Ottomans were perceived and looked at in the Arab world at that time. Today, Turkey wants to have a bigger role in the Arab world, and what is really a big question mark is how would this be received, or is being received by the population, the increased, the potential for increased Turkish role, whatever way, be it in Syria, be it through, for example, setting an example for the democratic or the movement towards the democratic system in Turkey. From your own readings, what would be your own sort of guess as to how easy that would be? Would history play a role here, or should we just see it in terms of a new generation trying to look at what is best for the country given the current reality? Or do you think the past plays a role in how, in the politics today, in the sort of attempts of Turkey to play a bigger role? Would
Yes.
your own research shed any light on these issues?
Yes. First, I think the revision of the rethinking of relations between Arabs and Turks began some time ago at the intellectual level, the academic level. It started with people like Abdelaziz Douri in Jordan and in Egypt, in the Egyptian academia, by many people rethinking the Ottoman period. Egyptian anti-Turkish sentiments was much softer than it was in Greater Syria and in Iraq. Partly because the Syrians and the Iraqis felt the brunt of the war much more. And of course, Egypt was autonomous from the Ottomans since the days of Muhammad Ali. So the revisionist historiography began much earlier, but did not filter down until, I would say, the 1980s. And the critical moment was mass tourism, which began to involve trade and exchange between Turkey and the Arab East. Istanbul became all of a sudden accessible, and to a lesser extent the Arab world accessible to the Turks. But by the 90s, Arab trade was very substantial. And today it's interesting. The only label that you see that is competing with China in the Arab world is the Turkish label. They are the only economy underselling the Chinese. So, and then of course the third phase started with popular television and soap operas that came from Turkey, were being translated, very popular, leading to a lot of divorces in the Arab world. So that actually rekindled or perhaps reinvented the image of the Turk in Arab eyes, which so far has been extremely negative as a result of the war. But of course, the crucial moment came with the new policy of AKP and Erdogan, and the ideological trends known as Neo-Ottomanism by Ahmed Davidoglu and the circle around the AKP that addresses the Arab world. And then later the Mavi Marmara and the Freedom Flotilla coming to Gaza. Obviously now the popular image of Turkey is extremely different than before, and it happened at two levels. First, the bonding between the AKP and Islamic groups, very close to the Hamas and Muslim Brothers until 2 weeks ago when Erdogan made his famous speech about secularism and the state, which did not go well at all with the Egyptian Muslim Brothers. But that's a minor incident, actually. What happened is that there's an Islamic role for Turkey, which is interesting, but there's also strategic alliances that are now emerging between Egypt and Turkey, and before that between Turkey and Syria, that are redefining the whole strategic role of Turkey. And it's quite often, not by Erdogan himself, but people around him, the Turkish intelligentsia are marketing this as a neo-Ottomanist policy, and people are willing to engage with it. And not only with the Islamic groups. So there's a completely new image for Turkey and a new image of the Arabs in Turkey, although it's not happening on the other side in the same manner. because with the Republican Kemalist intelligentsia, there's fear of the Arab for two reasons. Either because they remind them of the Ottoman past, which they're trying to escape from, and because their vision is towards Europe. But as the entry of Turkey to Europe collapses or fails, it strengthens Turkish strategy to the Central Asian republics and to the Arab world. And this is changing completely the picture in the Middle East, both at the conceptual level and at the level of practical politics concerning Israel.
This is sort of a personal question, something, because there's a bit of family lore related to the labor brigades that you talked about in my own family, and it's funny that you mentioned tourism as part of the way that relations have been warmed, because my father still refuses to go to Turkey, and in part it's because of this story about. So my father having been from Transjordan, Greater Syria, and being Christian, and they talk, and there's this story about fleeing to Palestine to escape conscription, or maybe it was conscription into these labor brigades. So was there some place in the West Bank that they would have gone to escape this reach? And this is around World War I.
Escape from conscription?
Yeah.
Yes, there was no West Bank then, it was all Palestine.
Yeah.
So you mean from the whole country, would they escape? Yes, people escape by many ways. First, by physical means, which was very difficult. Second, among the middle class, especially among Jews and Christians, there was the ability to become proteges of the Germans and the Russians and the Brits. All of them were in the enemy alliance, which put them in the enemy camp, except for the Germans and the Austrians, who were on this side of the alliance. Secondly, the rich people could buy off by paying the bedel, which is 50 Ottoman liras. 50 Ottoman liras were the salary of a judge for a whole year, so it was a very hefty amount, and only very few rich people can afford it. So that was a very exclusive way. Thirdly, in the countryside, people often resorted to hacking their fingers or taking off an eye, because then they would be unfit for service. That was more common than actually one believes.
Tow was very common. My family, there's a story of a tow that got lopped off to escape conscription.
To do what?
To escape conscription.
Yes.
Simple tow.
But physical escape was not easy in those days.
So they talked about going, I think it was to Beit Laham or near there. So they were leaving what is today Jordan and escaped to Palestine. But
Yeah, I mean, if they were Christians, one way to do it was to join a monastery
okay.
and hide to become like merged with it. But I think very limited number of people could do that. The fact is that the war killed, both through actual warfare and much more through diseases and untreated wounds, a huge amount of people. So there was a major demographic imbalance by 1918 in all of Syria. Experienced more deaths per capita than the whole world during the First World War. Much more than Belgium, much more than France, much more than Holland, even with the trench warfare, more than Russia. Almost 1/5 of the population perished in the war, which was higher than Russia and the Western European nations. So it was a major devastation. And it was, of course, demographic, because much more men died than women in the war.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Turkish side? There was the Turkish soldiers that you mentioned, and their views on the Arab rebellion and in the war in general, their attitudes towards Arabs and stuff.
Well, the Mehmet Fasih actually was I should say that the three were very strong Ottoman loyalists. None of them actually, the only one who expressed anti-Turkish sentiments would be our man, Ihsan. And he was mostly directed at Jamal Pasha and his entourage. But the others were strongly loyalist to the Ottoman state, and they invoked the name of the Sultan and the war with great awe. And this is certainly true of Arif Bey, who was in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. In the camp, there was a great deal of camaraderie between the Arabs and the Turks, and they felt that they were fighting in the same war. In fact, Arif translated literature from, he knew German, from German, not to Arabic, but to Turkish. I mean, Turkish was his, and he continued to write to his wife love letters in Turkish, which I use in the introduction to the diary, until the 1930s. Turkish was actually his literary language. So he had an affinity with his schooling in Istanbul, his loyalty to the army, and so on. And Mehmet Fasih talks about the rebellion in very negative terms, that it was a stab in the back, about Sharif Hussein's rebellion. Ihsan, on the other hand, welcomes it as a saving grace for the Arab nation and for the future. So they were split on this issue of the Arab rebellion, and not all the Arabs welcomed it. He explains it in very interesting terms. Even though he welcomes it, he explains it in the following terms. He says, from what we know, Sharif Hussein rebelled because the Turkish state stopped paying charges, stopped allowing him to collect pilgrims' fees. And so, and one aspect of it is that the Hijazi Railroad now brought the pilgrims to Medina, and they did not have to go through the protection of the caravans and the Bedouins, who were controlled by Sharif Hussein. So there was almost a Marxian economic interpretation of the rebellion by this very simple soldier, but he still supported them. So in short, there was division of this among the soldiers at the time. Yes. Faddal, Ustaz.
Oh, okay. I had maybe a more general question for you. I was wondering if you noticed any common questions of identity being asked. I wrote my question down. Being asked among Arabs with mixed backgrounds, or who traveled a long distance or forced to travel for one reason or another. What sorts of strategies do they implement to reconcile their identities when they're far away from their homeland, or when they come to realize that their mixed background has somehow influenced, reshaped their Arab identity?
Well, there's no identity anguish here, which is a very modern phenomenon. I mean, these people had a strong local identity. They were basically referred to themselves as Aleppin or Mersinli or Qudsi from Jerusalem. So their identity was strongly rooted in their township and city. To the extent that their national identity was a question, it was on the future of the Ottoman state. Which way will it go? Will it be a confederacy? Will it be an autonomous provincial empire? Or will it become a centralized state? So there was no identity crisis in the way we understand it today, but they were worried about the future, where they will end up. Sometimes you see the identity coming through the insistence that Arabic be used in official correspondence and in teaching. So that we know that this was a major demand by the Ottoman Decentralization Party and a major contestation with the Young Turks. The Young Turks insisted on centralizing the language of the state, and according to Hassan Kayali, who wrote a very important book about this, he does not see it as a Turkification policy. He sees it as a centralization policy. Because obviously, by the end of the war, the CUP was willing to consider a Turkish-Arab federation. So the language issue was not necessarily an instrument of Turkification. What happened, of course, is that there was Turkification advocates in the Ottoman leadership, and they finally ended up solving it through separation rather than through imposing Turkish language. Those who fell on the other side of the Turkish borders were Turkified. And that is a different kind of question, has to do with Kemalism, which had a problem of dealing with the minorities in a way that the Ottoman state had solved many years ago through constitutional arrangement. It did not see the Ottoman state as a Turkish state. Not even once in the history of the Ottoman state did they see the Ottoman state as a Turkish state. Some people thought the Turkish element was privileged and so on, but that is not as saying that Turkishness and Ottomanism were the same. In the Arab secessionist movement, of course, this issue became paramount, that we are oppressed not by the Ottomans, but by the Turkish component in the Ottoman state. And that's part of the process which led to its separation. So, of course, it's difficult to answer your question in such a brief interjection, but much of the debate about ethnicity and identity actually goes back to the post-1918 period rather than to the period of war and before it. Yes, please.
Just thinking about how you would use this book in more pedagogical or community outreach capacity, to teach people more about the hidden dimensions and the personal stories of the period of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm amazed I didn't know anything about the prostitution in Jerusalem. This to me is really a big surprise. But while you're talking about different historic and military events, I found myself thinking about the famous film Lawrence of Arabia. It might be interesting to sort of track and triangulate the different sorts of events between those if you were teaching about this, to see differences in scale and differences in imperial or non-imperial perspectives. And the whole issue about health crises, I think, is really interesting, because after the end of the Ottoman Empire, you had a lot of humanitarian intervention. AMIRA, American Near East Refugee Assistance, was initially for Armenian refugees. And if you ever saw the new version of Lawrence of Arabia, they issued a new one a couple of years ago that was maybe an hour and 10 minutes longer.
The editor's cut, you mean?
Yes, yeah, and the part that was really cut was really interesting. It was in Damascus, and it had to do with the injuries and the atrocities during the war, and people from the Red Cross going through some kind of makeshift hospital, and really being horrified at the health crisis of the whole thing. We're talking about the international community, stuff that wasn't in the original film, that I found kind of fascinating. So this idea of humanitarian intervention and large-scale health disasters and post-war suffering, it's interesting to see how that's handled in different kinds of writing. And
Yes.
It's intimate and local and personal, and then something like a big, epic sweep of a book like The Seven Pillars of Wisdom or
Yes. Well, I take it this is a statement, not a question. So,
That's the question, like how
yeah.
would you use this? About this.
One feature of the crisis at the daily level is how overwhelming it was. And one issue which actually quite revealing is the issue of hunger and the way hunger was treated. You see, much of the conventional historiography deals with hunger as a result of natural disasters, which is the locusts and bad crops, but also the acquisition of munitions, of cereals for the army. And of course, many people until today talk about how the Ottoman army cut trees as fuel for the fruit trees and olive trees, fuel for the locomotives, and also of requisitioning cereals for the army. But it's clear from these diaries that one of the main instruments forcing famine and hunger was the blockade on the Syrian coast, which was imposed by Britain and France. This is something that Elizabeth Thompson talks about in her book. It was the person who did most research about this is Najwa Qattan, actually, in her work on the First World War. The blockade was critical in preventing aid from coming by trade from Egypt, but also by what do you call it, salvation aid from Europe. So it was not only the internal natural disasters, but also the mechanisms by which the international communities imposed sanctions on the Ottomans in order to starve the population, in their view. We know that for true today, as a fact, to starve the population in order for them to rebel against the authority. And you could say it worked to some extent because I'm not saying the Syrians rebelled only because of the policies of Jamal Pasha, but it was a factor. And it's very reminiscent actually of the whole issues of sanctions in war today. I mean, it's as if nothing has changed in this regard. People impose sanctions in order to incite internal rebellion in the enemy area by the civilian population. It's a very interesting feature of this period.
Do we have a final question, perhaps? Yes.
Very briefly discussed the future of Palestine. I was wondering if the Balfour Declaration came up, but I think the diaries cut off before that.
Not in this diary, actually. There's a lot of reference to Zionists, and mostly in context of Jews who were funny looking, wearing European clothes, running around, making speeches, letting their women seduce Ottoman soldiers. I mean, in Ihsan's words, the Zionists were basically European Jews who were not religious. So they appear in a very surreptitious kind of, but no mention of the Balfour Declaration. Remember, he died at the end of 1916, and it was too early for. But there's a lot of references to the Jews of Jerusalem in this diary, and mostly in the context of the labor battalions. And in one instance of Jamal Pasha marrying a Jewish woman called, I forgot her name. She became later, she was actually Jamal's mistress. There were rumors that he married her. And she was mentioned as an emissary for the Zionists. But that's just as a reference to who she was. And then she became the wife of the famous lawyer Abikarus. I forgot, she's a very famous, beautiful woman from Jerusalem who was the mistress of Jamal Pasha. So that's a very marginal reference to the Zionists in this period.
I think we have run out of time, so I'm going to thank Dr.
Thank you.
Tamari for